So maybe, Robbie, I could start with you, just because you have really been looking at the social impact bond. Could you tell us a little bit about the program that you're hoping to finance with the social impact bond?
We're in quite a unique position compared to what you've seen, or what we've all seen in the film, in that nobody's asked us to develop a bond. We decided to look at this as another strategy to possibly fund a really critical program in our community. And we looked at the area of depression because it's a specific focus of ours. And we also have about 14 years of data that gives us really good advice about what to do and how to help people improve with depression. So much as like we saw earlier, we don't need to do the testing about what could work. We already have a really good template for what can make a difference for people with depression, and really we want to test this. So we're actually working with Mars out of Toronto, and what I really like about this is that it's a gated process, meaning it's 4 stages. We've just finished the first stage, which is the feasibility assessment. And the recommendation was that we move forward to stage 2, which is really where we build the bond. The gated piece means that at any point in time we can say we don't want to go forward. And really the critical piece for us is that if we were to move forward to the end and actually work with investors, it has to be fully aligned with everything that we do and that we want. And most critically, it has to be aligned with our values. Because we don't, as a charity and nonprofit, we can always benefit from the funds. It'll make serving these clients easier, but we're not in the position where we need the funds in order to do some of this important work.
And Martin, maybe I could ask you, there's a lot of community foundations that are actually investing in social impact bonds, but your organization, as I understand it, has decided not to participate in that model. Is that correct?
We have not decided not to invest in them because there hasn't been any to invest in. As the movie noted, there are at most 4 in all of Canada. So I certainly have my own analysis of the incredible unlikeliness of CIBS doing anything the least bit useful, but that of course does not mean that our foundation might not consider investing them. If there were such a thing, I know Ontario seems to be thinking about 1 or 2, and I think I heard rumors about one in Saskatchewan, but it's hardly a tsunami of social impact bonds. And I expect, we'll eventually get into why I think this is such a ridiculous idea. But while I have the mic, Sir Ronald's a great guy. He's done a lot for the social finance movement in Canada and indeed around the world. He's completely misguided and mistaken about social impact bonds. You got to be clear on this, and the film is absolutely brilliant because every single one of those social interventions is top-notch, absolutely wonderful, well-researched. I don't know about the heart and stroke thing because we didn't get much details on what their actual intervention was. But quality early childhood, I forget the name of it, but we call it Housing First here in Alberta and in most of Canada. All the stuff is incredibly good, solid, well-researched stuff that we as a society ought to be doing more of. And if I actually thought that CIBS was a way to get us to do more of, then I would be more interested in CIBS. But those are really cool interventions.
Timothy, I was wondering do you see this helping your clients in any way? Do you think you can deliver better services with this financing model?
Oh, I asked for a yes/no question. No. I think, when we look at social rights of citizenship, I think they have to be provided through the government. And there is one way I think that the corporations who are interested in corporate social responsibility can kind of do social impact bonds, and it's a little thing called corporate taxation. So then it isn't based on the attraction of the program. It's based on authentic social rights of citizens for everybody. Now, these things first came about in 2010 through David Cameron. And David Cameron didn't have any money to pay for social programs because in 2008, with the predictable crisis of the capitalist markets, he spent billions of pounds bailing out banks. The same thing happened in the United States. So these were kind of due to market failures that the government doesn't have enough money to be able to pay for these programs. Yet we're heading over to the market to help them solve complex social issues. Now, when I worked in homelessness, I'd be working with people who are urine stained, brain injured, people with mental health issues, addictions. These were not people who would be really attracted to market commodification. But more importantly than not being attracted to market commodification, they were people, like that John guy, like that Reginald guy. And as soon as we commodify people's value into this revolution of so-called revolution, I think I have a different understanding of revolution, but like the revolution of turning into a profit from social issues, I think that's ridiculous. And I can't see that the amount invested plus the profit is equal to supposed inefficiencies and ineffectiveness of public programs. So I think a lot of this could be based on transformative social policy. And one of the things I'm still in love with, even though I'm proved wrong on many occasions, is the welfare state, which guarantees social rights of citizenship from cradle to grave. And I think there's too much reliance on the market, too much reliance on corporate social responsibility. Instead, we should hold corporations to task for paying higher taxes. We could also have something called capital gains tax. And there's a lot of mechanisms that could be put in place. People are not suited for commodification when it comes to social services.
And James, let me bring you into the conversation. You've actually done a lot of work in looking at social finance. When we talked on the phone, you said they can be a good thing or a bad thing. It really depends on the details of the social impact bond. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, social impact bonds are something where there's a heck of a lot written in a very short period of time. It's shocking how much interest there is. The Stanford Social Innovation Review has at least 30 articles on the topic. It's only been around 8 years. In Canada, only 4 years. So there's actually like an embarrassment of analysis out there, including a lot of academic articles. Yet, it has to be said, the jury's still out. I mean, most of the good analyses out there, like the Brookings one that was mentioned, are basically, they're pretty consistent with what Martin is saying around the notion of, yes, okay, they're funding generally pretty effective interventions, things that we like. They're preventative models, they're wraparound approaches. They're the kinds of things like the Sheldon Kennedy Advocacy Center does, the kinds of things that the Calgary Counseling Center does, really proven, data-driven, well-researched interventions. The question is, do you need a social impact bond to do it? And in most cases, you don't, unless there's some very specific kind of meeting of circumstances. And one of those is of course, starved welfare state conditions. The other, and to me, the more intriguing condition is where there's an opportunity to do what we might call social R&D. So, and this is where it's not the Goldman Sachs that come to the table, it's things like foundations, using their endowments, or shall we say, more enlightened corporate players, people like ATB, people like credit unions could do this, where they actually come to the table with more than a profit motive. They actually have an authentic social impact interest. And that's where it could be powerful, because government, I'm not so Pollyannish about how great government is, because sometimes government will have low cost, warehouse focused, paternalistic, low-risk interventions that might not actually be that effective. And if you get a foundation or some other group of enlightened, well-informed investors, people like Esme Fairbairn, who is pretty much the only one in the documentary I actually would trust, who could help allocate funds to a social experiment that's truly risky, that's actually de-risking what government would never be expected to do. So imagine an experiment, for example, where you decriminalize all narcotics as a form of intervention, much like Portugal did. Well, we couldn't have the political will to do that. So you can't say, well, we rely on government to do it, our stronger welfare state, because you know what? They're not going to do it. But if you had a laboratory that could actually go in that direction with robust analysis, third-party evaluation, and so on, you might actually get somewhere. So it has potential, but in most cases, they're kind of things that would have happened anyway or should be happening anyway. They're not terribly, SIBs don't drive innovation, not yet, but they might be able to.
Anybody want to respond to that as a possibility?
Anything's possible, and in this whole realm, we're operating with virtually zero evidence. So, you know, there's all those articles in Stanford Innovation Review, and, you know, one SIB has actually been completed, you know, in the entire, you know, this sector of the universe. So I think that's a real problem. The issue, though, of R&D in the social sector is a huge one, and there's certainly potential there. The question, I think, is whether SIBs, even theoretically, are an appropriate way to finance R&D. And I think about it first from the nonprofit social service organization. If they finally have a chance to get some investment in an intervention that they attach their name to, are they going to want to do that with something that they don't actually know whether it works or not? Or are they going to pitch something that they actually know works and are confident they can deliver on, and finally are getting some money either to properly evaluate it or to do it? When you are the nonprofit that has done the first SIB in your community and it's an abject and obvious failure, what do you think your odds are of getting invested in the future? So I think that kind of funding is going to be actually counterproductive to innovation, and that's why, in fact, almost all the SIBs certainly all the ones we've seen in the movie, are not the least bit innovative. They're really good, but we've not only been doing, but we've been studying very carefully quality early childhood programs for 40 years. That's certainly one of the social interventions that has more evidence than any other, and we know it works. So I think that connection between R&D and innovation is, I mean, you can hope that SIBs would somehow do that, but I think that's just about the least likely outcome, at least anytime soon.
I just want to add something in that when we have these financial instruments, I think it's important that we adopt a precautionary principle, you know, where in science don't really implement something until something is really tested. And so I think it's important that we do a thorough evaluation, because at face value, this will appeal to people. They'll say, well, there is this myth that the private sector does everything better and more effectively and efficiently than the public sector. In some cases, that might be the case. But if we apply a blanket approach and allow investors to direct where social policy and programming goes, it does become a problem. And secondly, if programs do work, you know, Martin mentioned or Head Start programs for young people. These aren't new things. We see these programs when they're effective. We see the absence of those programs leading to lower than results. Like, for example, the schools in Forest Lawn do very poorly on the Fraser Institute's grading of school, which is an aggregation of their testing scores. I don't believe it has anything to do with the school itself, with the students in that school. It has to do with structural conditions that are in place that prevent these children from learning. So if we know what works, we as a society, from a justice perspective, have to fund those rather than going to the market and help assuage the guilt of corporate social responsibility.
I have a bit of a different perspective. I don't disagree with everything you're saying, but I think R&D and innovation in the social sector is absolutely critical, and nobody's funding it. There are almost no opportunities for us to go to a foundation, to go to donors, to go to other funding bodies and say, we want to try something really cool, really innovative. We have a lot of data and we want to test this new innovation. Nobody's funding it. I've had data, really good program data that's been evaluated externally by some of the world's best researchers in psychotherapy. And it hasn't resulted, all this really cool work hasn't resulted in 1 cent of new dollars. So what we're looking at is this a vehicle that can help us? That can help us take a new program to the marketplace, and most importantly to our community, to people in need. And that's, as an agency director and somebody responsible for meeting the needs this year of probably 9,000 Calgarians, I have to look at different opportunities to see what can we do to meet the needs of this community. And this to us is one possibility. And I say possibility because we don't know what decisions we're going to make at the end of stage 2 and 3, and if we get to stage 4. But I do know one thing, is that we know our business. Most funders, most investors don't know a thing about counseling, don't know a thing about mental health, don't know a thing about outcomes. And the people that I'm looking to work with are people that want to be with us in the long run and that want to be on what I would call this learning journey. If their only objective is to earn a return on their investment, then I'm not particularly interested in working with them. If they're interested in learning about how we implement a SIB in an agency, what we learn from doing that, how we can, if it's going to be useful to others, to even us and others, then what do we learn about that? So that's my interest in it. So it's kind of partly academic, partly very practical, and I'm really curious to see. I have no idea what's going to happen in stage 2 and whether we're going to decide at the end of it to go to stage 3 or to step back.
If you can get the government to pay for that, I think that'd be great.
We'll see.
Yeah.
And which government?
Well, any government.
Yeah. And we don't know if the payer is actually going to be a government, because it could be a foundation, it could be an individual investor. They're typically governments, but not always.
Well, when you open your Edmonton branch and come to the foundation, ask us for an R&D grant. Don't try to sell us a SIB on it, because I think your program sounds excellent for a grant, okay?
Do you give grant money to R&D, Martin?
If we had as compelling a program as this one in terms of having that body of research, most nonprofits, because R&D is not funded by anybody, they don't have data about whether their programs work. I mean, so many of our social interventions, with a few exceptions, are particularly at the specific level in terms of how the program is actually implemented. We don't have much very good information about that. And part of the reason is that the government or anybody else doesn't pay for that because decisions are not made based on evidence. So it's kind of irrelevant to, to waste money doing that. We just want to pay for the program, we don't want to fund administrative costs like research. So, I mean, that is a problem, but it sounds like you have a lot of really interesting data about what could work. So I think that would be a very compelling proposal that wouldn't require a SIB. Anyway.
I think James, did you want to add?
Well, I guess I'm finding myself arguing slightly for SIBs, which is weird to me because I actually used to be quite cynical about them. And the one thing that should be noted in fairness for these experiments is we've had since the 1980s various forms of government attempts to fund performance, and some of these were quite cruel. They were like, you perform nonprofit and then we'll pay you based on potentially spurious metrics, and expecting the nonprofit to do its own evaluation with limited resources, et cetera, et cetera. So this, relative to that, has to be acknowledged as an improvement because A, the money's there up front, and B, there's actually at least a hope of more of a whole of community or whole of systems approach with different players and different eyes on government, different advocates who kind of start to feel the nonprofit's pain because they're sitting at the table and can maybe have some power to kind of to advocate on their behalf. So there's actually a few things that should be noted relative to other forms of sticking it to nonprofits that have been with us for a very long time, that are worth noting in defense of SIBs.
Okay, maybe we'll take some questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes, so it'd be nice to hear what you have to say.
It sounds like SIBs are new, so there wouldn't be any evidence of whether or not they would address a reduction in the poverty gap. But it seems like they're designed to further a capitalist society. It's not necessarily addressing this root cause, and it seems like it's really furthering an increase in wealth gap that we know from evidence is not helpful for things like mental health, for housing, for really any of the issues addressed in the film.
Yeah, the profit margin, David McDonald, the guy from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, periodically puts out a report which talks about the income gap in Canada, but he also talks about the wealth gap. And, so there's a more accumulation. And he mentioned that the top 87 families in terms of wealth have an equivalent to 12 million Canadians. There's that. And there's a certain irony. By the way, it's October 17th, the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty kind of got lost, I think, in the shuffle about the legalization of a certain product. But so yeah, I think you're completely right about we're commodifying something, we're increasing profits, and it's that income inequality, but perhaps equally important, that wealth inequality that's causing the issues. And none of those issues were really about, as you mentioned, were about poverty reduction. They were dealing with the consequences of poverty. If we really want to do that, what we need is a comprehensive anti-poverty strategy, which will include adequate housing. And it's going to include early childhood education. And it's going to include all those dimensions, but it has to be done in a comprehensive way. And it also has to be targeted at the root causes of poverty, which are based in equitable distribution of resources.
So I agree. I agree with everything you say. I agree that SIBs do not at all address root causes. They addressed pretty robust, well-worn, well-proven preventative measures from what we can see. With respect to the question, is this ushering in a kind of Trojan horse of capitalism? I don't think so, because there's as many people who advocate for these things in Canada who kind of come from the view, and it's probably crazily naive, but I'll say it anyway, that imagine a society where, or an economy where we actually had the entire system work towards social impact. So maybe SIBs are the Trojan horse for that, to actually move away from a profit motive or a growth motive to more of a social impact motive. We organize an economy based on social outcomes. That's probably crazily naive, but just to say the people who advocate for this, they aren't always like the Goldman Sachs folks who just expect a financial return and expect everything to be commodifiable. By the way, Goldman lost their shirt on the Rikers Island thing. I'm not sure it was covered in the film. And they actually perversely were bailed out by the Bloomberg Foundation, the charitable foundation, that's crazy. That is objectively nuts. So
No, but
stuff
corporate
like that
welfare
makes me-
has worked for decades. You know,
Sorry. Yeah,
it's
no,
only poor people that can't have socialism. It's perfectly fine for corporations.
Take another question from the audience. Yeah.
I have two. So one was, how do you know that the companies are picking out people who are going to succeed in these programs and leaving the rest behind? And has any of the people investing in this actually spoken and heard from the people who are living in poverty and going through these CIBS programs to see if that's working for them?
Okay, on the first question, Irina Kovrenko at the University of Regina wrote a piece last year. It's one of the best pieces I've read in Canada on evaluating the 4 social impact bonds that are actually underway in Canada. It's a really good piece, and she has a pretty good deconstruction of that, because she said that's one of the chief critiques of these social impact bonds. You can cherry pick, or you can leave out, you can kind of cook the numbers based on who you know is going to perform in the system, et cetera. So she's pretty good at sort of forensically saying that's like putting that to bed and saying, no, so far there hasn't been much evidence that that takes place. What she does critique is the heart and stroke one, she says, is a mess. It's basically conflicts of interest, they're poor outcome measures that aren't really outcome measures, they're just easily cooked outputs. She basically says that one is a mess. It's not a really useful case study, but there's 3 others that I do have actually some pretty good, robust learnings and pretty hopeful learnings attached to them. The other point you mentioned, though, around user-centered, and that came up in the film, I think we've done a terrible job of that. I rarely see it raised as a critique of CIBS. It's a really valid critique, yeah. No, I think we need to get better on that.
Again, to speak on behalf of CIBS, it's not that user-centeredness has a very big role in any other social intervention that the government does, and not all that big a role in the interventions of many nonprofits, which are also driven primarily by what the funders will fund. So it would be unreasonable or surprising to expect that investors from New York would somehow have a lot of interaction with, Queen Street or Chicago homeless people when that's not much of a criteria even for all the other social programs either.
But it's a great idea that I'm going to take back to my team.
Cool.
I was going to say that I think there is a bigger separation of worlds, though, in the CIB model compared to when foundations are funding something. At least they're acquainted with these problems. They've probably read more about them. They've talked with social workers who are out there. But I have to say, when I was making the film, certainly you could feel that J.B. Pritzker, Sir Ronald Cohen didn't have any sort of firsthand knowledge of the issues that their programs were trying to address. We have one more question.
I was just
One
gonna
more.
say, the CIBS sound a lot like back in the day when it was the Industrial Revolution, and that's what kickstarted primary education. Really, was just to conform people to follow rules, follow direction, so that these industrial corporations would grow, and it's just easy labor. So these CIBS sound like corporations trying to get their hand and their voice, their opinion, into a place where I personally don't think they need to be involved, personally, their money or their opinion.
If that's the perspective of an investor that came to me with respect to the SIB that we're trying to develop, we would generously say no thank you. This really has to be aligned for our organization. The investor and their interests have to be aligned with our interests. And one of those, the critical interest is meeting the needs of the people with depression. The second interest is really about learning about what impact this is going to make and whether it's a strategy, an investment strategy that can work for our community and our clients. So if they're not interested in that, I don't think we have a deal.
Last word, Timothy.
I think you're completely right, though, and it could be another measure of social control, right? That they could come in and control things. And the fact it's in the private sector means there is no democratic recourse. That woman from Mainstay, where she was talking about the trigger points, and personally what I saw in her face was a torment between wanting to serve the people and having to meet the needs of the investors. That's unethical and immoral from my perspective.
I agree with you. I would not have applied or been part of the SIB that we saw in Toronto. Because in the discussion about the outcomes, and the outcomes weren't necessarily the agencies, the housing agencies' outcomes, they were more the government outcomes, there was complete misalignment there.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming and talking with us tonight. Really appreciate that. Thank you.